Welcome to Exclusive Insights, Navigating the Maze of SEC Cybersecurity Requirements for RIAs. We will get started in just a moment. First, to get started, there is a little series of buttons along the bottom of your screen. You can use that Q&A button to ask us questions during the webinar. Will you do me a favor and just click on that Q&A button and make sure that it comes up? Being in technology, I know how these things can always go sideways and always at the worst possible time. So if you can hear me, would you just type "I can hear you" in that little area where there's a spot to type a question? Awesome, great, thank you. One more request. If you can see a kitten on your screen, will you please type "I can see you"? Awesome, all right. Finally, you're going to want to grab a pencil or something to write with. There is a lot we are going to go over, and you will want to be able to refer back to it later. All right, a little bit about me. I'm Jonathan Addington. I am the president and founder of JM Addington Technology Solutions and Cybersecure RIA. I began my official career in tech in 2004. I began JM Addington Technology Solutions in 2010, and as we became more and more focused on the financial services industry, we focused cybersecure RIA specifically to secure advisors. And cybersecurity has been our focus since the very beginning. Today, we have a full staff to support RIAs across their full range of technology needs: cybersecurity, IT support, and cybersecurity compliance. All right, and why should you care about cybersecurity? Because the SEC says you should care. And even if you're not SEC registered, there are at least 15 states that have similar regulations for cybersecurity for advisors to the SEC's, and many more have regulations that apply to all of the businesses within their state boundaries. Here are the things that we're going to go over today. First, we're going to talk about why the SEC created the cybersecurity rule in the first place. Then we will cover the 5 elements of a comprehensive cybersecurity program as the SEC outlines them in the proposed rule. Then we will look at the reporting the SEC will require, especially the new Form ADVC. Next, we will take a look at the public disclosures that will be required in the event of a cyber incident. And finally, we will look at what technical implementation may look like at your firm. Let's get to the first section here, the why. The why is important because it explains the reasoning behind the rule and the reasons the SEC is likely to start enforcing it today. And it's not complicated. The SEC believes that cybersecurity incidents will affect the marketplace and investors unless marketplace participants take steps to mitigate the risk from cybersecurity attacks. Today we're focusing on advisors, but the SEC is also targeting funds, public companies, broker-dealers, and more. And as you probably are aware, cyber attacks are going up everywhere, and they're going up exponentially. While the odds of attack vary by source, all sources agree on one thing in 2024. Whether it's phishing, a virus, or ransomware, or something else, most businesses will be attacked this year. That includes yours, and that is a lot of risk for investors. To take a stab at quantifying that risk, the most current SEC filings show $126 trillion in assets under management by SEC registered advisors. Of that $126 trillion, nearly $29 trillion is invested by individuals and not just institutions. So you can see where there's a lot of risk even just for your average retail investor here. And the SEC clearly believes that they've got the power to enforce these rules already. Remember that the SEC is looking at this through the lens of risk to investors and the marketplace more broadly. There are a lot of rules that already cover some of this ground, but They're often unclear, they're overlapping. The SEC has enforced similar regulations under Gramm-Leach-Beachley, the Investment Advisors Act, Regulation SP, and SID. But the environment has changed significantly, and today it makes sense to condense these regulations down into a single rule. Here's a handful of the regulations and laws that the SEC references in the proposed rule. Again, this is backing up the idea that they've already got the authority to be enforcing most of the contents of this proposed rule. They note very early on in the rule that advisors are required to minimize risk for clients as part of their fiduciary obligation. And this goes beyond just minimizing marketplace risk, right? This is the cornerstone, this is the foundation of many, if not most or all of the regulations that RIAs have to adhere to. It is the foundation of your commitment and your obligations to your clients. And this, of course, includes keeping information confidential, having backup and disaster recovery plans, business continuity plans, proper administrative and technology controls, and much more. And finally, you got to remember that even though it's in a proposed state now, the SEC has it on their agenda for April, so 2.5 weeks away. What the SEC wants to tell you, they can enforce this today. Whether or not the rule becomes official, these are the standards the SEC is going to hold you to. Let's take a quick look at security versus compliance. There's overlap, but they're not quite the same thing. Security is following the spirit of the rules, the regulations, and it's actually keeping things secure. Compliance requires that you can prove, that is, you documented that you did all of the things you said you were going to do, and that those things are in line with the standards that have been set by the regulatory bodies. So security often includes things like identity and access management, mobile device management, software updates, and so on. Then the compliance is documenting these things, that you had policies and procedures and that you've reviewed them regularly. And it's where those things overlap that you have compliance. And of course, compliance is not perfection. This is the process of setting up your own policies and procedures that meet the SEC's minimum standards and then living those out. This, of course, does not mean that you will never have an incident. In fact, you can assume that this is a win and not an if for your company. And this isn't all paperwork either. This is the crossroads of security and documentation. So let's start with the cybersecurity program. This is part of the rule. This is the core of the rule. There are 2 additional portions of the rule, disclosures and record keeping. We will go over those after the cybersecurity program. So real quick, the SEC does not use industry and standard categories, unfortunately. They lay out the program a little bit differently. They have 5 different elements. First up, risk assessments, then user security controls, information protection, vulnerability and threat management, and incident and response recovery. There's some overlap between those 5 categories. For example, there are assessments both in the risk assessment, number 1, and under vulnerability assessments, number 4. And while this and some other things can be separate procedures, especially for smaller firms, they're going to end up being the same thing. So in some cases, you'll hear us address them the same, in some cases separately. The risk assessment. This is fundamentally a business risk assessment. And to be clear, you need to have senior management involved in this process. And you're really asking a couple of questions. If we lost access to the system, would operations be degraded? If we lost access to this information, would operations be degraded? Or if this information was accessed without authorization, so by hackers, is there a substantial likelihood of loss or risk to investors, or would they think so? The first step of the risk assessment is identification. So this means identifying the systems that are central for your operations. It means identifying where and what information you have. And it means identifying your service providers that either have access to those systems or access to that information. And you need to keep in mind that service providers can be a real broad category. It can include accounting, IT, outsourced HR, outsourced compliance, CRMs, portfolio management, custodians, and more. Next, you need to categorize the systems and information that you identified. Are these essential to operations? Are they communications? And then you're going to classify the risks. So how sensitive is this information? Is it a list of names, or does it include social security numbers and account numbers? What are the implications of this information getting out? And are there backup systems that we can easily use? So then you need to prioritize those risks. We recommend that you create a simple and clear matrix for the prioritization. And that's going to be real important later on for defining what a significant cybersecurity incident is. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. The second portion of the cybersecurity program is user security controls. And this is where you're trying to minimize risk by securing users, their access to information, and how they access it. This is different than minimizing risk to systems, which makes sure that the systems themselves are secure. Think about securing your office. The lock on the door is how you secure the system, but controlling who has the key would be the user security controls. SEC lays out 5 broad categories they expect you to implement for user security controls. That first category are requirements for how users act. So this would be things like acceptable use policies, network use policies, policies on not sharing passwords, etc. This is not unlike your code of ethics. Next is identifying users and requiring credentials for them to prove who they are. So at its most simple, this is username and passwords. Multi-factor authentication should be on all of your systems, or at least on every system that supports it. And some systems would also allow for MFAs such as physical key cards or biometrics. The third category are standard operation procedures, especially for credentialing. So that just means having an SOP for timely distribution, replacement, and revocation of passwords and other credentials. In other words, what's your SOP when you hire somebody, they transfer positions, or somebody is offboarded? Fourth is the need to know principle. So this is where you restrict access to systems and information only to those people that are required to access it for them to do their job. Really, this is something you already should have in place, something you could have had in place 20, 30, 40 years ago. This is implementing it at your technology level. And then finally, you need to require that users are only able to have secured remote access to systems. The third area of the cybersecurity program is information protection. Now, if you're familiar with healthcare, you know that there's some specific standards for what constitutes protected health information, PHI. Under HIPAA and most other frameworks, some, but not all information needs to be protected. The SEC has a different tack. You need to protect all of the information. So I'm not going to read these definitions, but you'll see that as the SEC defines information that needs to be protected, they manage to use the phrase any information 3 different times. And while I hope they tone down this definition a little bit in the finalized version of the rule, it is a pretty clear-cut definition. If you've got information, it needs to be protected. Now, that doesn't mean that all information is equal or should be protected equally. If you remember that you did the risk assessment, one of the steps was to classify that risk of severity. And you're going to do the same thing with information protection. For instance, the address book on your phone might have all the cell phone numbers for your clients, your top clients. It's reasonable to keep this information protected by a PIN code or Face ID on your phone. However, that would not be a reasonable standard to protect access to, say, a list of client bank accounts. You need more than a PIN code or Face ID for information of that level of sensitivity. So The sensitivity of the information matters. The severity of unauthorized access to the information matters. Your information protection will, of course, be informed by the risk assessment that you did at the beginning of your program. So after a proper assessment, you are going to have an inventory of where your information is, its level of sensitivity, what systems you've got, and so on. And then you are going to put in access controls and technical controls to access that information. And of course, you're going to prioritize also based on the potential effects of an incident. Then you're going to protect that information, and then you're going to monitor for signs of threat actors already in your network. So here are some examples of different controls and procedures that you might put in place as part of your information protection program. So that's continuous monitoring, it's making sure everything's encrypted, putting in place data loss protection, access controls to systems. We'll go over some of this a little bit later in the webinar. Now, another core part of the cybersecurity program is vendor management, also called vendor due diligence. So this is performing due diligence on your vendors. This essentially means making sure that they are going to protect access to their systems, which contain your data and your client's data, with the same standard of care that you use internally. You could just give them the slide deck and tell them that they need to comply with the same standards as we are laying out here. Then you need to have written contracts in place that outline the responsibility that they have to you. They need to commit to these security standards in writing. We also highly suggest that you have them commit to notifying you in a timely manner if they believe that they have had a security incident. Number 4, step 4 of the cybersecurity program is a threat and vulnerability management program. So this is a process to detect threats and vulnerabilities and then either mitigate or remediate them. Let's define these terms quickly because they can sound like the same thing. So a vulnerability, this is something that could go wrong. It's an inherent weakness in a system, a control, or a procedure. A simplified way to look at a threat is that this is something that is going wrong, in the sense that there is an event that already occurred that may lead to an intrusion. Typically, but not always, this would be through a vulnerability. So this means that you've already identified your vulnerabilities during your risk assessment. Then detecting threats is an ongoing process that you need to be alerted to when there's an event that may lead to an intrusion. Without going into details, this is usually accomplished with security monitoring tools. Now, mitigation, that's lowering the risk that a vulnerability presents or the potential severity of a security event. Remediation is completely removing that risk. Now, in a lot of circumstances, maybe even most, you'll only be able to mitigate the risk. These are the examples the SEC gives for firms to put into their vulnerability programs. You do not have to implement all of them. What you choose to implement should be based on your risk assessments and your prioritization of risks. Now, the more of this that you can automate, the better. Your automated systems, they don't sleep. They work 24/7, and they are far less prone to make mistakes. Finally, we've got incident and response recovery, and this really could be its own webinar, so I'm just going to highlight the outlines. So the IRP is your plan to respond to an attack. Even for small firms, a plan matters, even if it's only 2 or 3 pages. So first, you need to define who is going to be on that IRP team. It needs to be a cross-functional team. Second, how are you going to classify the severity of an attack? Third, how are you going to initially contain that threat or mitigate the risk? For example, is shutting down the systems a good response? Not always. Fourth, you need to be ready to report that incident to the SEC, then to your clients, and then you need to be ready to have a broader response to the threat. How are you going to eliminate it? And then finally, how are you going to get things back up and running again? So if you've lost data How are you going to restore from a backup? How are you going to get possibly lost transactions put back in place? It's a lot harder than you think going from an incident back into full operations. It's more complicated than just say we're going to recover from the backup. Now, you are only required to report significant incidents. That's a little bit of an unwieldy definition. We really recommend that you've got a very clear matrix that's going to define what constitutes a significant incident for your firm. And this is for two reasons. First, it's going to greatly simplify your response, and especially in the middle of an incident, it's going to help you make better decisions. And second, we expect that this is going to be really important post-incident, especially if you chose not to report it, so that you can show why this was not just a subjective decision when the SEC's got questions for you on it. Finally, you must review your cybersecurity program at least annually, or more often if there are material or relevant changes either to your firm or the environment. You're expected to have written reports that document this review. This is super important. The rule makes it clear multiple times that this annual review is a critical part of it. So you need to have the program, and then you also need to be reviewing it for its efficacy. All right, let's take a look at changes to disclosures. First, there are changes to the ADV2 form. The SEC wants to know what type of controls you've got in place and when you've been attacked. Most of the changes to the ADV2 form are not confidential. Then you're going to have changes to your CRS. This part is obviously not confidential. This is where you're going to need to list incidents that have occurred for the last 5 years on your CRS. It's going to be where you need to describe the risk that you have as well as mitigations. Of course, everyone's got a link to their CRS at the bottom of their web page. And can you imagine adding a section that lists every successful cyber attack against your firm in the last 5 years? Under the rule as it's currently written, you'll have 48 hours to notify the SEC after you've got a reasonable basis to conclude that there's an attack that's either underway, or 48 hours after you've come to believe that an attack occurred. You will notify the SEC via a new form, the ADVC, which I believe is short for cyber. Very creative, clever, those folks. Now, at the IAA Compliance Conference, there's a panel on cybersecurity, and they wanted to emphasize that this reporting is not for enforcement purposes, at least not yet. The SEC wants this so they have visibility into attacks that are relevant to its oversight of markets as a whole. Next, you'd have 48 hours to notify clients of incidents, and you will be required to disclose previous incidents to prospective clients. As part of your preparation, you really should have a lawyer who specializes in cybersecurity incidents on speed dial. There are specific ways to respond to attacks legally. You don't want to use just your general business attorney. It is great if you have a template to communicate with the SEC. So this would probably mean having an ADVC form that's partially filled out already. And you're going to want to avoid trigger words like breach or data loss or intrusion. You're only going to use those if you're absolutely certain that those are the correct term for the incident that's occurred. And it would be great for you to have a pre-game strategy on what and how you communicate to your clients and the outside world. And this is going to include how you will communicate if your communications are down, what you will communicate, what level of detail will you give people, and how are you going to phrase it. And again, using the correct language makes a huge difference here. Now in that 48 hours, the public company rule that the SEC put out in July was a little bit more relaxed. So we'll see if that time period really lands at 48 hours for RIAs. I think that it will be at least 96 hours. So next up is record keeping. We're going to keep this really simple because it's what you already do. You're going to keep 5 years of policies and procedures, a written report of your annual review, copies of any ADVC forms you filed, documentation of any incidents that you've had, and the documentation of risk assessments that you've completed. Let's talk a little bit about the technical side. Now, each of these technical controls would really go back up to a policy or procedure or both. We've covered the contours of that. I'm not going to dig into that further here, but just know that any of the technical controls that we cover really should be corresponding to a policy that you've also got in place. So most business owners and executives are not responsible for implementing IT and cybersecurity controls, but they are responsible for the business and the business risk as a whole, which means that you at least need to have a lay of the landscape. So you might think about it like this. You probably don't do all of your own bookkeeping, but you also probably understand it well enough to know if your bookkeeper is competent or not. And you definitely need to be able to understand the final numbers on the balance sheet and the P&L. And that's the same logic for why you at least need to have an idea of what goes into the technical controls. So we're going to look at some of the top things you can do here. So first is application whitelisting. Now, traditional antivirus blocks programs whose fingerprint matches that of a known bad application. The major downside of this is that if it's a new bad program, one that hasn't been previously discovered, or one that changed its fingerprint, the antivirus will probably allow it to run. Application whitelisting is the opposite approach. Unless the fingerprints for the program is known to be a good application, it won't be allowed to run. All right, EDR, endpoint detection and response. Antivirus and EDR is really a continuum, with antivirus being on the most basic protection end of that continuum and EDR being more complex. Historically, antivirus only looked at the contents of files, that is their fingerprints, but EDR looks at an overall set of actions and behaviors. Some EDRs incorporate AV, others of them run in addition to AV. MDM, mobile device management. This is the enforcer. This is a system that makes sure the policies that you have in place are actually enforced on devices. So for instance, MDM is not encryption or EDR, but it will enforce that encryption and EDR is on a device. And it might not allow access to data or remote systems unless those devices are compliant with the policies you have in place. So a real common use case of MDM would be making sure that users have PIN codes or passcodes on their phones, and without those in place, you can't access email or other remote systems. Password spraying, credential stuffing, and other forms of simulated attacks are commonly a part of a vulnerability program. This is kind of like a stress test on your systems to see where they're weak. This can detect both poor policies and poor procedural implementations. Geofencing and geographic monitoring. This is one of my favorites. Geofencing denies access to systems and information if the subject is not in a known good location. Sometimes this gets a bad rap because it's pretty easy to circumvent, but in our experience, most attackers don't bother most of the time. This map shows where the last 10,000 connection points for all of our clients came from, and you can see how many malicious events were occurring outside of the United States. So geofencing is still a very effective way of protecting your network. Data loss prevention, DLP. This is a set of active scanning policies and procedures designed to keep sensitive data from leaving your system. Here's an example of DLP. This is what it looks like inside of the Microsoft platform. So you can see that it fits into protection, into data governance. It works with vendors. It's really part of the larger security framework. Now, I know this looks super complicated. For larger organizations, it really may be this complicated. For smaller firms, it's usually much easier to implement. VPNs and SASE. These are both means of securing remote connections. They can also be used to ensure that access to sensitive systems are only allowed from specific connections. So this can be used in conjunction with geofencing. So at our company, most of our critical systems can only be accessed from a handful of good known traffic sources, such as through our SASE. Phishing simulations, this is a common form of training and vulnerability testing. Phishing emails are sent out and you see who will click on them, who will put in a username and password. Then executives get a report on that later, and typically you require training for people that clicked or put in their username and password. Dark web scans, these are a way to see what credentials from your company are already for sale on the dark web. The hacker's Amazon, you can see what's for sale. If you're interested in a free dark web scan for your company, send me an email and I'll make sure that we get started on that for you. Security Operations Center, a managed SOC, is a third-party service that monitors multiple portions of your network for intruders, vulnerabilities, and compliance. Typically, this involves monitoring your cloud services, your servers, firewalls, endpoints, event logs, and your security tools. A SOC typically has both an automated element as well as human investigations and analysis, and some SOCs incorporate the response to mitigate and eliminate those threats as well. Password managers. So these are used for two primary things. What you normally hear us talking about is storing your password. So cybersecurity professionals want you to have a different password for every website you visit. And of course, that's important, and the password manager is going to help you keep track of all of those. But while in a perfect world, you're never going to share passwords, in reality, sometimes you have to. So the second thing password managers do is help you share passwords within your organization in a secure way and in a way that can be audited and reported on later. So what's the next step? Get a free pen test from Cybersecure RIA. We will take a look at the external portion of your network, but much more importantly, the internal of your network. We will give you a fantastic report on what it would look like if an attacker got inside your network. And while this definitely does not fill out a complete cybersecurity program, it is a fantastic way to get started. And for small and mid-sized firms, it's really a core part of doing that risk assessment as well. If you're not ready for that, why don't you go ahead and download our ebook for advisors on the cybersecurity rule. The link is up here on your screen. It goes over what we went through in this webinar in just a little bit more detail, and it's a great resource for you if you did not take notes on the webinar. All right, would you be willing to give me some quick feedback and just put a 1 through 10 in the Q&A on how valuable this webinar was for you, with 10 being it was a fantastic use of your time and you'd recommend to all of your friends that they attend it as well. All right, thank you for attending. I will stick around for a few minutes for Q&A. Just go ahead and type a question into that Q&A box or raise your hand. If you want that pen test, email cybersecurity or pen test to info@cybersecureria.com. You can also see the link to download the ebook here. Thanks. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.